We've got the real bell this morning. And that is actually the bell I travel with that we use on the program. Actually, I'll keep it down this morning. Because from my experience of these sort of events, on day 2, there are 2 groups of people. Those who did and those who did not. What am I talking about? No, please. Those who went to bed at a reasonable hour and those who stayed out drinking all night. Do we have anybody in here who will proudly tell me they've been up all night? All right. What about a 6 a.m. to bedder? 5 a.m.? 4 a.m.? Any 4 a.m.ers? 3 a.m. Yay, good on you. 2 a.m. 1 a.m. Midnight. Bunch of old farts who had an early night. God. We've got to have somebody before the day's finished who actually stayed out all night. Oh, this isn't a real convention. Ladies and gentlemen, at 4 o'clock this afternoon, we are going to draw, I would say a raffle. We're going to pick the number for the registration number by machine. And that, of course, is for the 30,000 Rand. Go on, 30,000 Rand. Which would just about buy you dinner last night. Okay, we start this morning with somebody I know and I believe is going to absolutely put us in our place in terms of trends, politics, economics, and demography. He is a lawyer who is going to put us right on what we can expect in the future. A firm favorite at the SAPOA conference. Ladies and gentlemen, it may be early, but we can still give a very warm welcome to JP Landman. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much that I can join you again. I must make a confession, Richard. I'm one of those old farts. I was in bed by 9:42. I woke up at about 3:45 and I thought, who the fuck is this guy who's coming to his room now? So there is one of you who did it, I know. I heard you. And then I had to get up. Anyway, guys, it's lovely to be with you. Richard and I are going to talk about the local and the global outlook. I will obviously do the local, he will do the global outlook. And from that outlook, we want to see signposts. From the outlook, we want to see signposts. And I thought the best way of doing this is the best way of giving the signposts is to give you 3 scenarios. And I want to build those scenarios in the briefest possible way. I want to build them by combining 2 things that I think are important. Is or are. Is or are. English is such a rubbish language. Anyway, guys, I want to give you 3 scenarios that will help you or can help you to develop the signposts from which one can get the outlook. Because, make no mistake, the best people at judging the outlook are entrepreneurs and business people like yourselves. People who have made money. People who are surviving out there under very, very difficult circumstances. Nobody can beat you when it comes to having a grip on what the outlooks are. So all I can do is to give you scenarios that can help you to identify a couple of signposts. And as I've said, I want to combine 2 things. The first one is I want to look at economic growth. Now, you can use the term economic growth, you can use the term cash flow. I just use plain old English, the process of getting richer. That is really what all economic growth is about. It's about getting richer, generating more cash flow. And that's the arrow that runs up and down on the screen. But then the arrow that runs horizontally deals with social capital. What is social capital? It is simply the glue that binds a society together. And that glue consists of trust, relationships between people, and networks. That is what it consists of. Think of social capital in this way. Money is your financial capital. You keep it in the bank. Your human capital is your skills. You keep it in your head. Financial capital, human capital. Social capital is what binds you to other people, and you put it in the relationships between yourselves and others. You're all business people, and you all know that it's impossible to do the business that you're doing unless you have a network with other people and a whole range of relationships that you have with others. That's your social capital. That helps you to drive your basic process of running your business. Now, the one, economic growth, is very tangible. You can do a graph, you can do a table, you can run a time series, we can express it in numbers. The other one, social capital, is completely intangible. You feel it, you sense it, you recognize it when you see it. So we have two very different animals on the screen here. But if we take the money side, the cash flow side, the economics, the up and down arrow, and we combine it with the social capital with the glue, then you get the four simple quadrants that you have on the screen. And obviously the best quadrant to be in is the top right-hand side. There your cash flow is getting better, you're getting richer, there's more money, but at the same time the glue that binds you to other people also gets stronger. The worst place to be on the opposite side is bottom left. You're getting poorer, your cash flow is disintegrating, but the glue is also going. Now, to make all of this practical, give me an example of a country in our region which is bottom left. Come. Zimbabwe, no question about it. If you come from Zimbabwe, you would want to argue. But most other people would agree, and most Zimbabweans, I think, as well, that is where they are. You know, the last time, before dollarization, the per capita income in Zimbabwe was where it were in 1951. Just think of that. I think they dollarized in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, 2010, 2011. At that stage, their per capita incomes were sitting where it was in the beginning of the 1950s. So really, they got poorer, no question about that. And the glue has also dissipated. On the other hand, give me an example of a country in our region which is top right. Botswana. Botswana, no question. And those of you involved in property in Botswana will know that country is a remarkable success story. So you've got two countries, both of them on the borders of South Africa, the one bottom left, the other top right. Where is South Africa? No, don't be an economist. Don't tell me in the middle. Where is South Africa? Well, it's a matter of subjective opinion when it comes to social capital. I think we're sitting in the top left-hand side at the moment, and I'll show you the data to back that up. And that's really the three scenarios I want to give you. The one scenario is make it work, which is the title of Mr. Trevor Manuel's National Plan, National Development Plan for 2030, which is now very much in the news. They talk about the target in that plan is a growth rate of 5.4% per year growth by 2030. Clearly, that would put you in the upper right-hand corner. The national plan is also very strong on social cohesion, what they call social cohesion, what I've just called here social capital. So that's where you will be if you do the national plan. On the other hand, if we grow at 1% a year, which is equal or slightly less than our population growth rate, then we'll be getting poorer. And I think that social tensions in your society would be such that you will simply not be able to build and generate social capital. I just can't see it. So your decline scenario, and there's your second signpost, is economic growth of 1.5% or less. Then clearly you're bottom left. If you're in the third scenario, which is the muddle-through scenario, then you're getting richer. That'll be the top left quadrant. You're getting richer, but your social capital is not going that strongly. And I think at the moment that's precisely where we are. We're sitting in that muddle-through scenario. And the muddle-through economic growth rate will roughly be about 3% per year. So those are the three scenarios, and from that you can see your signpost and develop your outlook. Now let's look at economic growth, and let's just refresh our memories. Since we've become a democracy in 1994, our growth rate, as you know, has increased enormously, substantially. I read the other day that the South African listed property sector on the JSE is now amongst, I think, the 7th or the 8th biggest in the world. It is absolutely astonishing what has happened in our property sector, as all of you and the people who invested in you can testify. Well, a huge part of the reason for that lies in the difference between the numbers 1.55 and the number 3.3. So that's where we come from. Unfortunately, as I expressed last year in Durban at the SAPOA conference, we have been schneidered by the bankers, the investment bankers, who gave us the 2009 global recession, also here in South Africa. And what the global recession has done is to put us in 2009 also into a recession. But then, that's more importantly, it stumped our growth. When I spoke to you at the first time that I came to SAPOA in 2009, I went through my notes to see what I've told you. And in 2009, I said to you that I expect a growth rate from 2010 onwards of 3% per year. Well, you can see there that I was wrong. We'd made only 2.8. We did not get to 3%. That's now for 2010, 2011, and 2012. For 2013, as you very well know, the Minister of Finance is working, and all the economists are working on a forecast for this year, this calendar year, of 2.7%. Why do I have a red question mark behind it, 0.7? Because I think all the indications are that that target is under pressure. And it might very well be that we end the year not with 2.7, but 2.4. I see some people are now even talking about 2.3%. The global scenario is not good, and locally we managed to do a few things wrong, like strikes and so on, which helped to keep our growth rate down. But in general terms, I think it's possible that we can do 3% over the next 3 years. So I will renew my 2009 forecast. As you can see there, at the moment, the consensus from the economists is a number of 3.5%. I've got 2 question marks behind that one, simply because what we've learned about consensus forecast, they start high and then they tend to come down as the year progresses. And already, people who spoke about 2.7% 2 months ago are now calling 2.5 and 2.3. So I suspect that 3.5% for next year is too high. We'll probably end up with 3%. And there now you can do the maths. If for 2010, 2011, 2012, you do 2.8%, 2013, you do about, say, 2.7, 2.6, well, that's 4 years already. Now, for the next 4 years, you will have to do about 3.25% a year to average out at about 3. And I think that's doable, but I think what it also tells you, you cannot expect to do much more than 3%. I listened to a CEO of a property company the other day, who made the following statement. He said that's his opinion, I'm just repeating what he said. He said that the office market in South Africa is under pressure, the office segment, and he doesn't think that will improve before growth doesn't go to about 3.25%. If that CEO is correct, then that tells you something about the tipping point or the signpost that you need to get things going. And I think we will get there over the next 2 or 3 years, but it's certainly slower than what I indicated to you in 2008 or than what most people now indicate. But from that, ladies and gentlemen, you can also see why I talk about a muddle-through growth rate, which is 3%. I think that's where South Africa is at the moment. We have a particular political leadership. We sit in a particular global environment. We have a particular set of circumstances in the country. And I think it's reckless. I think it's reckless to talk about 5 and 6% growth. You're just bullshitting yourself, that's all. But I think it's equally reckless to talk about decline and collapse because 3% is not good enough. I will deal with that argument shortly. But I do think one must stay away from those 2 scenarios. The 5-6% scenario, the 1% scenario. I think none of them are on the table. Okay, there is, just as a footnote, there is what Mr. Trevor Manuel's national plan envisaged, 5.4% growth, and you can see it is very far away from the 2.7 that we're currently more or less sitting at. So it's a huge haul to get to that number. Make absolutely no mistake. And to illustrate what a haul it is, I want to take 2 areas. Investment and employment. They're both critical for your industry and for the country. Look at investment. The national plan calls for the public sector to spend 10% of GDP, or 10 cents in a rand. Let's not make it difficult. GDP is nothing else but the country's turnover. So 10 cents in a rand must be spent by the public sector on investment. You can see that currently the Zuma government is doing about 7%. 7.1 this year, maybe 7.2. Call it 7. That is a very good increase from the 4% that we had basically when Mr. Zuma was fired in 2005. That's a nice increase. A lot of that was bequeathed to him by the Mbeki government. Nevertheless, they're sustaining it and they're carrying on. But there's a huge difference from 7 to 10. The plan calls for 10%. There's a fantastic distance from 7 to 10. It's not that easy. At the moment, we're sitting with a current account balance deficit of over 5%, which is putting pressure on the rand and doing all the other good things that you know. Imagine if you add 3% to that. Those of you who studied your economics will remember S minus I equals X minus M. Don't worry about it. But basically, the more you invest in excess of your savings, which is what we're doing in South Africa, the more your current account balance opens up. You add 3 to the I, your S stays the same, the gap opens up enormously, and our current account deficit will move from 5 to 8. It's a very difficult thing to do in practice. From the private sector, it's the same story. The national plan calls for the private sector to invest 20% of GDP, or 20 cents in a rand. The latest figures we have, the new number should come out soon. In 2011, the private sector did 12%. You add 12 and 7 together, you get 19% total investment, while the national plan asks for 30. So you can see we have a way to go before we can get to that 5% growth. With 30% investment, you will do 5% growth as sure as I'm standing on this stage. That's almost a given. But you first have to get to the 30% investment. And as you can see there, it's not that easy. However, don't be caught out. Don't be caught out. A couple of years ago, I was invited in Johannesburg to a session with a property company that will remain nameless. And the MD of that property company, and I really take my hat off to him for his honesty and his guts. The MD of the property company said, we want to have this session and talk a little bit about things because we made one big mistake. We thought the goud train won't happen. Daar's nou 'n manier om 'n gat van jou te maak. We thought the goud train won't happen. So now the goud train is happening. It wasn't open yet, but it was happening at that stage. And the MD said, and we've got none of the prime properties. We thought it won't happen, and we've got none of the prime properties. Now, you see that again in the table. Look at that 17, which is in brackets on the screen. What is that 17? The 17 is the number in Mr. Trevor Manuel's plan of total investment, public plus private sector, total investment at the time that Mr. Manuel and his colleagues wrote the plan. That's only about 18 months ago. And they were, of course, using data from 18 months earlier. And now already, investment has moved 2 percentage points from 17 to 19. So don't be goud-trained. Don't be goud-trained. We might find that this thing picks up quicker. There's a lot of negative comments out there about the private sector's low level of investment. You can see public sector doing 7, private sector doing 12. You know, it's a small difference. Public sector not doing enough, and that's true. The public sector isn't doing enough. But I also am absolutely convinced that when the business cycle turns, which it will do at some point, you will see the private sector take off. That's how it always works. No reason why it shouldn't do that again. Just for you as a signpost to take with you, traditionally in this country, if you take a 60-year history and you go back to after the Second World War, in South Africa, 2/3 of all investment comes from the private sector and roughly 1/3 from the public sector. So clearly we're out of kilter at the moment. And that's one of the reasons why I think the private sector will come back big time and you will see investment. But what I want to illustrate with these numbers for you is to give you some hard numbers that you can work with to see which way are we going. Are we going towards a 5% scenario or a 1% scenario? And clearly with these investment numbers, you're not doing 1%. Yesterday afternoon, I happened to have lunch with the chief executive of ArcelorMittal, which is a very impressive woman. Okay, I've done that bit now. She's also very sexy. I almost can't remember what she said. I'm so glad I'm in South Africa and America. I'll be sued for sexual harassment. In any case, she made this one comment. She said she has absolutely no qualms about Medupi and Kusile being finished because she knows where they're sending their steel. And she made the comment in the context of somebody asked me about water. And I said, well, if you look at the budget and you look at the spending programs, there's a lot of money going into water infrastructure. And that's when she came in and she said, absolutely. Their second biggest client after the 2 electricity power stations Medupi and Kusile. Their second biggest client are the water boards, who's taking a lot of steel from them at the moment. And that's what these investment numbers mean. It means steel, it means cement, it means fixing the infrastructure of the country. But if you want to go to 5, you'll have to do an incredible amount more than what we're doing. That's really what I'm trying to give you here. The second one is employment. Now, I discussed this slide last year in Durban, but A, it's updated. B, I want to drive a point home, which I think is not, I did not drive home, which is not driven home enough in our public debate. South Africa has got a very interesting paradox. We employ more and more people, and at the same time, we have more and more unemployed people. How on earth? Before we explain it, just look at the numbers and take them in. The first column there, the actual number of people working. The first time we counted everybody in South Africa was in 1995, after we became a unitary state in 94. Remember, where we are now used to be outside South Africa. So the people who used to work here at Sun City was never counted as part of our labor force. Now, of course, we count them. So the first time we counted everybody was in September 95, through surveys. 9.5 million people were working. Today, end of March, 13.6 million people were working. So don't give me jobless growth. It's an absolute nonsense statement. You can't have jobless growth if you create 4.1 million jobs. You can see what happened to the employment rate, what I call the employment rate. The economists talk about the absorption rate. It went from 39% to 41%. Simply meaning 41% of everybody between the ages of 15 and 64 are actually working. Whether they're in the labor market or not, whether they're economically active or not, they're working, and 61% are not working. Your unemployment rate is not 61%, but forget about that. And then your next two columns, you can see the number of people unemployed on the far right-hand side, and you can see that number has increased from 1.9 million in 1995 to 4.6 million today. And right next to it, to the left, is the unemployment rate in percentage terms. Is there anybody that want to argue with me that what we're seeing is the paradox of more employment and more unemployment at the same time? Do you buy that? I think you really can't fight with the numbers. And this trend is continuing. Last Monday, we got the unemployment numbers for March, the ones that you see on the screen. Think back of the news last Monday, those of you who watch TV or listen to the radio or read your newspapers on Tuesday morning. Everybody spoke about the 25.2%. Everybody spoke about the 4.6 million unemployed people. Nobody spoke about the fact that at that stage we're employing 13.6 million. Now, what changed over the last 12 months? Well, this is what changed. In March 2013, we employed 200,000 more people in this economy than what we employed in March 2012. Yes, there were more unemployed people too, 75,000. And everybody talks about the 75,000. Nobody talks about the 200,000. Yet for you as business people, for you as property developers, and for us all as citizens, there is no more important number than the 200,000. Yes, it's terrible about the unemployment. Yes, we must cry, and I do have a handkerchief here. And we can do that, and you must do your bit through your NGO and your church and wherever you do your bit. Do your bit, don't stop doing it. But don't be gautrained. Don't miss the fact that we've got 200,000 more consumers and therefore also 200,000 more taxpayers than what we had in March 2012. Can you see the point that I'm trying to drive home here? The paradox of South Africa is more employment and more unemployment at the same time. And from this you can see two future scenarios. And they're given to you on the next page. The next slide, I repeat the numbers, except I've got a projection there for 2022, which is my projection. And what I'm saying is that at a 3% growth rate, that muddle-through growth rate, I use that 3%. Then we can add 3 million jobs to the economy over the next 10 years, to the end of 2012, to the end of 2022. But Mr. Manuel's plan on the 10-year longer time horizon calls for 11 million more jobs, up to 24 million. Now, whether we get there in 2030, I don't know. None of us knows. We don't even know whether we will get to the numbers I've got there for 2022. But what I think the numbers clearly tell you is that you will have a growing economy with more consumers, with a bigger tax base. Remember in South Africa, and this is terrible news for you, I know you don't want to hear this, but all of you who pay income tax only contribute how much of the fiscus? Only 1/3. I know you don't want to hear that. I know you think that you pay all the taxes in the country and you carry the entire country. No, it's not true. Over the years, we've developed a wonderful system of indirect taxes. And indirect taxes, VAT and petrol, basically, and then if you drink and smoke a lot like I do, then we make an extra contribution. So you should actually salam me. But indirect taxes contribute the majority of the money that goes into our fiscus. So if you employ and exploit a man working in your garden and pay him only 40 Rand a day, that 40 Rand ends up paying somewhere for a taxi that puts petrol into the taxi's tank, and the taxi, like all other motorists, 1/3 of the petrol price taxes. He takes that 40 Rand on his way home in the taxi, and he stops at Checkers or Spar. Heaven forbid that he stops at Woolworths. He stops at Checkers and Spar, and he goes and buys some food, and he pays 14% VAT. A proportion of the 40 Rand goes into those tax sources. And that's why an increase in employment is extremely important from a long-term point of view, building the society. But what you can also see on the screen, at a 3% growth rate, we're not going to do anything about unemployment. Unemployment will probably hover around 5 million for the next 10 years or so. The number of people. The rate, of course, will come up or down a little bit, but that's not important. The real important thing is the number. And therefore, as a society, we will have to start thinking differently about how we deal with unemployment. If there's one piece of fiction, you know, the biggest threat to economic thinking is what I call the Charlie-Stron law of economics. You know the Charlie-Stron law of economics. It works like this. It illustrates the difference between like and likely. I would like. My wife knows that I would like. I would passionately like. I would really like to make love with Charlize Theron. You will agree with me, it's completely unlikely. So always in economics, distinguish between like and likely. Yes, we would like to have full employment. Yes, we would like to have everybody in a decent job. Is it likely? That's the reality you've got to work with. Is it likely? Now, I think the reality of the world in which we live, and The Economist had a very good article on it 2 weeks ago. No doubt you read it. Globally, the problem is the demographics are busy overtaking economics. And unemployment, especially of young people, is a phenomenon that is likely to stay with us for a long time. And I think you see that in these numbers. And that's why we have to start thinking differently about how we deal with them. I was watching last night, just before I fell asleep at 9:42, I was watching Mrs. Helen Zille on TV going on at Orange Farm. I really take my hat off to that woman's energy. It's incredible. And the DA now has a proposal. Well, they've had it for a couple of years now. They've got a proposal in their policy platform that they want to pay a basic income grant to all South Africans below a certain income level. And that income level, if I remember correctly, is a wage of 3,750 Rand a month. Below that, or unemployed, well, that's below 3,750 if you're unemployed, you get this grant. Which ironically makes the DA the only political party in South Africa that is in favor of extending the social grant system. And when I saw this the first time, I thought, what on earth is going on here? As I'm getting more and more into this problem and understanding it better, I think the DA might have something, hulle mag iets beter. They might be onto something there, because we will have to think differently about how we deal with unemployment. On social capital, or the glue in our society, just want to make, it's a complicated topic, but just want to make 2 comments. I personally come from the school that thinks, that says, as I'm going to do now, that I think we have a low level of social capital. That a lot of our social capital was destroyed with the very difficult political and economic and social changes that we've gone through. And that's why that explains corruption. It explains a lot of the social evils we have in our society. That's the one comment. But from time to time, it is foreigners who actually give me a different perspective. I was talking to an Argentinian who emigrated to South Africa, lives in Pretoria, works in the agricultural industry. He tells me, he disagrees with my comments about social capital. He says there's much more social capital here than in Argentina. I say, why? He says, you know, in Argentina, I can't buy a Mercedes. I can't buy a Mercedes and drive around with it. The ethos of society will not allow me. The first thing I did when I arrived in Pretoria, earning more or less the same amount of money, bought myself a nice house, but I also bought myself a Mercedes, because here it's tolerable, it's not a big issue. The other one was a professor, a biodiesel expert from the University of Ohio, in Ohio, who came to South Africa to that marvelous town, Bothaville. The steak is very good there, and they import the wine. And so he and I were in Bothaville. The farmers of Bothaville brought him out to come and talk to them about using maize for biofuel. He traveled South Africa for 2 weeks, never been here before, did his homework. And we spoke. And somewhere between the second and the third bottle of Cabernet, he said, you know, there's something about this country that amazes me. All the divisions that you can have in a society are present in South Africa. Rich, poor, white, black, urban, rural, gender freedom, gender liberation versus very strong patriarchy. Is that the word? Very strong male domination. You've got 3 different religions and more: Jewish, Christians, Muslims, and counting. You've got 11 languages. He says the divisions in this society are so enormous. This country should blow up once a week. But the country is not blowing up once a week. So maybe there's what the Argentinian was saying and what the biofuel professor, now remember he's a biofuel professor, he knows nothing about social capital. He's an engineer. The lovely thing about engineers, when you talk politics to them, I really love it. They are, you know, they are as straight as anything. He never used the word social capital. But what I heard him in telling me his experiences, I heard the theme of social capital. And both of them said they think there are some remarkable things here that keep the country together. I must say, I remember the conversation in Bothaville very well, because the word that you use to indicate these divisions is the word cleavage. It didn't do it for me. So, if you look at, it was this cleavage conversation that then, and of course the Cabernet, that then brought me to say, why don't I look a little bit at the one aspect of social capital that you actually can measure in numbers? Remember, I said to you it's an intangible thing, and that's corruption. And what you see on the screen are 3 different sets of corruption measurements, the 3 that I know of. In fact, number 1 and number 3 are in a sense linked. But there's Transparency International, who does a ranking of countries, and you can clearly see the ranking there of the BRIC countries and South Africa. There's the World Economic Forum Competitiveness Report, where they ask business people, to what extent is corruption a problem in running your business? And you can see the answers there. That's the only one where South Africa is not in the first spot. Brazil has overtaken us. In the time that I've kept this table, Brazil used to be second after South Africa, but they've moved up and we've moved down a little bit. That 9.2% for China, a friend of mine who works in China tells me that one shouldn't take that seriously. He says in China, if you fill in a survey and you say corruption is a problem, you will certainly get clapped. So her opinion is ignore the 9.2, it's much higher, but let's work with it, and you can see South Africa still comes out quite well. And then the Heritage Foundation is a right-wing American outfit. I deliberately went to look for a right-wing outfit. What must I do with a left-wing outfit? I mean, you know, that doesn't help me. And the right-wingers are putting up a scale there, and you can see that the average was 59.6, and the only country that got more than the average was South Africa at 61.8. We are, by and large, the most honest of the lot. Very sobering, isn't it? Very sobering. The second thing that jumps up at you is Russia. Russia is consistently by far the worst. Now, in 2010, I went on a study visit to Russia, and we had a marvelous time. But the one thing that strikes you about Russia, you never see a darkie. There's no such a thing as a black man. After 2 weeks, you so long for that, you phone home and you say, please SMS me a photo. I just want to see a black man. Which then brings forward the very interesting question. These white people in Russia, why do they steal so much? And if you travel through Russia, you notice that they're not just white, they're Lani whites. Every town more or less as big as Klerksdorp, yeah, it's got a symphony orchestra, a ballet company, an opera house. My wife goes to these things, I just stay in the bar. But she can't just get in. These places are full. Monday night, Tuesday night, Thursday night, these places are full. So it's lolly whites. But they steal the milk out of the coffee. Why? And that's the second thing that jumps at you from the screen. And the answer to that, if I can take a detour, came to me, I think, in May last year. This slide is a few years old, but in May last year, I was in Mauritius. No, I wasn't at the Gupta wedding. And I was reading a book, which I recommend to you. The English title is Endgame. The Afrikaanse titel is Eindstryd, which is the book written by Professor Wille Estreise from Stellenbosch University, retired now, on the secret negotiations in the 1980s between the then banned ANC and the old National Party government. And Estreise, as you know by now, was a go-between between them. And he described these secret negotiations. And one of these secret negotiation sessions took place, note the dates, South Africans, on 16, 17, and 18 December 1989. Mr. Mandela was still in jail. The ANC was still banned. Names like Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma were completely unknown to us. Well, some of us. In that December week, in 1989, the ANC delegation, which included Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, by the way, met up with the South Africans in the British town of Flitwick, in the British platteland, British rural areas. There's a big castle there. So what they do, they come in the dark of night, they rush into the castle, they close the gates, then they stay in there for 3 days, they come out again and nobody knows that they've been there. And this in Flitwick session is recorded on page 165 of Estreise's book. And then the second top paragraph on the right-hand page, there's the following paragraph. At the Flitwick meeting, Thabo Mbeki said, "The liberation in South Africa will be accompanied by huge corruption." And then he said why, he motivated why. He said, because when people are released from suppression and liberation, everything goes. And in that chaos of everything goes, there's huge corruption. And when I read this in Mauritius last year, it was before 10 in the morning, so I haven't had a drink yet. And that's why I remember it. When I read it, I thought, but that explains this table. Look at all the countries on the list. Russia, China, huge suppression. Huge suppression, huge corruption. Brazil, a military government until 1988. They became a democracy a few years before us. Ourselves, well, you know our history. Don't have to explain it. You will say to me, India. You will argue India became a democracy in 1947. Yeah, that's true. But economically speaking, India was under neo-socialism, a very severe form of economic repression, until 1991, when they started the process of economic liberalization. Told you English is a rubbish language. So I think there's a huge amount of merit in Thabo Mbeki's analysis. And you see it when you apply it across different race groups, different geographies, different countries. I think the numbers tell a fantastic story. And that says to me that corruption is simply a social capital thing that we have to work through. And my sense is you've got to get cultural and value change around it. And my sense is it's beginning to happen. If you look at the ANC, they're now talking about corruption as if they have nothing to do with it. It's huge progress. It's huge progress. Now, if you take economic growth, just to get back to the getting richer or poorer process, there is our history. You know it as well as I do. For 20 years, 2 decades nearly, we got poorer, and then for 2 decades, we got richer. And the trend at which we're going is roughly about 2% a year. Going back through my notes, I saw that last year in Durban, I showed you this slide. I always use it, keep it updated, because I think it is such a powerful slide. It tells us where we are. And last year, it was a period of 18 years, and we were 32% richer. It's now 12 months later. Where are we now? It's now 19 years, and we're 34% richer. Last year we were just under a third, and we're now just over a third. That consistent muddling along, that consistent improving yourself. And that, I think, is where South Africa is going. So my favorite scenario of the three is the muddle through scenario. Those numbers speak for themselves. Just look at them. You generate more cash. You have more mouths to feed. As long as the cash is more than the mouths to feed, you end up with resources that you can use for distribution and for building your society. I've given you the employment scene. There will be 2 million more customers 7 years from now, 3 million 10 years from now, that will need to go into shopping centers and retail malls and so on. I'm not suggesting more should be built. I really don't know. But what I am telling you is there will be more customers earning money that will need accommodation. Our real fight, I think, for the next couple of years is going to be around social capital. I want to just introduce one thought, and that's the thought of incrementalism. The older I'm getting, the more I'm going around, the more I think social change is never about the big jump. It's never about the big move. It's about the small increments. I've got no knowledge of this topic, but everybody tells you if you want to lose weight, don't do 10 kilograms in 1 month, do 10 kilograms over 10 months. I mean, it's theoretical to me. I don't bother with things like that. But it's the same sort of story. It's the same sort of story. Do it incrementally. Do it incrementally. And I just want to make that very practical. If we grow the economy at my muddle-through growth rate of 3% a year, then in the first year, it gets more in the second and third years, but in the first year, you will add 100 billion rand to the national pot. Oh, how much is 100 billion rand? Well, it's 11 million rand for every hour of every day. Those of you who went to bed after 12, for every hour that you didn't go to bed, or every other hour, it's 11 million rand. What do you do with that 11 million rand? Well, you can do a lot of things. 2 of them stand out, geysers and social grants. December last year, my wife and I went down to the coast, and as we always do, we meander through the country, travel about 5,000–6,000 kilometers before we get there. And the one thing that struck us, you drive through RDP houses or past RDP houses, you drive past poor farm worker houses. The one consistent change, the large number of solar geysers on top of those little houses. And this intrigued me, so I started scratching. In the last 12 months, 377,000 solar geysers were installed in poor households. Meaning, for the first time, people had running hot water. Think about that. Multiply the 377,000 houses with, say, 4 people per house, you end up with nearly 1.5 million people who never had running hot water who now have it. I stopped at one of these places, at Tweede. You know where Tweede is? Well, right next to Corredo. And I spoke to an old man living in one of the houses. He's 72 years old. He looked 105, but he was only 72. And I asked him about the geyser, and he said he loves tea. He loves tea. In the past, he had to go and collect wood, make a fire, boil the water, and then he can have his tea. Now, this geyser is only about 1.5 meters above his head, small RDP house. He just opens the tap, and he immediately has hot water in his mug, and he's got his tea. That's incrementalism. His life has changed dramatically. His children's lives have changed dramatically. That's what 11 million rand an hour can buy you. And that's incrementalism. That's the way we're going to go forward. And you see it all beautifully illustrated if you look at social grants. I know the narrative is that social grants is not sustainable. It's the biggest bum-cum. I constrained myself nicely there, didn't I? It's the biggest rubbish. There's a 10-year figure there, going back to 2006, all the way to 2013, plus 2 more budget years in Mr. Pravin Gordhan's budget. So you've got a 10-year period. Over the 10 years, you increase the number of social grant beneficiaries by 43%. You go from 12 million, basically 11.9, 12 million, you go all the way to over 17 million. And the cost of doing so, in spite of the 2009 recession, remember there was the recession in the middle, 2009. In spite of that recession, remained constant, more or less constant, at about 3.2% of GDP. What is not sustainable? Wat is nie volhoubaar nie? I know there's this narrative. It's a rubbish narrative. Don't fall into it. You're too clever for it. Just look at the data. Just look at the data. And when you look at this, then you can start understanding where the DA is coming from. If you have a little bit more growth, which is what they promise to do, then obviously you'll have more money and you can spend more money. We tend to go religious about these things. I prefer not to do that. I just look at the data. I just look at the cash flow. And the cash flow tells me if you can roll back poverty, which we did, and if you can roll back inequality, which we're doing, but with the help of social grants, what on earth is not to like? What on earth is not to like? Just to complete the picture, in South Africa, if you add the 3.2% to other social security expenditure we have, where you end up at about 5.3% of GDP that we spend on social security in this country, you know what the number for Brazil is? 13. 13. So let's curb our fears and our rhetoric around this. So to conclude, where are we? We're trying to work with two very different things. The one is very hard, it's cash, it's money, it's economy. The other one is an intangible, it's social capital. We venture and we put these two things together in a simple format, and we say from that you can develop scenarios. The scenarios you can fill in with numbers, and those give you the signposts, and from the signposts you can develop the outlook for yourself and your industry over the next couple of years. You saw the graph. We were getting poorer in the 1980s and 90s, beginning of the 90s. That black arrow went down relentlessly. And you saw that we're now getting richer. We're now 34% richer than 19 years ago. Last year in Durban, we were 32% richer than 18 years prior to that. So I think there's no question about that the blue bubble has moved up. I used to have that arrow going up straight, and then in a highly scientific process, I tilted it to the right. And it was the man from Ohio and the Argentinian, but it was also the World Cup. For 6 weeks. For 6 weeks, we had no crime. For 6 weeks, we murdered nobody. I raped a few foreigners, but that's all. For 6 weeks, South Africa was an incredible place. And then, of course, we went back to our old ways. So maybe there is more social capital than what we allow for. That's also what we learned from the corruption numbers. And that's why I tilted the arrow. And there are people, I've quoted one to you, who says that we're on the other side of that line. I should move the bubble across. I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. I think it's still unfinished business, and we have more to do. But you can clearly see here where we fit in. And, ladies and gentlemen, that is where I think we are. We're in a muddle-through phase. We're busy recovering from a long period of not going anywhere. We now clearly are going anywhere, somewhere rather. And that is in the bag. That is behind us. And there's your sensitivity analysis. If you want to repeat the 34%, you don't need another 19 years. You can do the job in 16 years, 3 years shorter, if you use my muddle-through growth rate of 3%. If my muddle-through growth rate of 3% is too high, and the 2.7%, which is sort of hanging around now, and which has been our track record since 2010, if that is the number, then you can see we can again do the 34%, and this time it will take us again 19 years. I don't see decline. I really don't see decline. What I see is just a constant incremental improvement, a process of muddling through. For that, you can still have your success. All you need is the right mindset. With that journey, I wish you enormous luck. Thank you.